She said, "May I ask you something before you leave?" And my heart nearly stopped. Captain Elias Drake stood at the edge of the observation deck, gazing out into the vastness of space. The stars were scattered like diamonds against the black velvet of the universe, and the hum of the Vanguard's engines was a familiar comfort. He had spent most of his life in space, exploring, fighting, and leading his crew through the unknown. But today felt different. This mission was going to be his last. He had known this day would come, but now that it was here, he couldn't help but feel a pang of uncertainty. The mission was simple on paper: lead the fleet to the Outer Rim, negotiate a peace treaty with the rebellious faction of the Zarakans, and return home. It sounded like any other mission, but Elias had seen the signs. The Zarakans weren't the only ones in the galaxy with their own agendas. Elias was leading the largest fleet humanity had ever assembled, and behind the peace talks, there were deeper, more dangerous forces at play. But that was not what bothered him today. What bothered him was the encounter he had earlier in the hallway. "Captain," the voice had called from behind him. He turned around to see Serafina Vex, standing there with that familiar, mysterious smile of hers. She was always so composed, so professional. But there was something in her eyes today that made Elias pause. Serafina was the head scientist for the Galactic Alliance, a brilliant mind who had helped shape many of the technologies that had made humanity's expansion into space possible. She was known for her analytical approach to problems, never allowing emotions to cloud her judgment. But today, there was something different in the way she looked at him. "May I ask you something before you leave?" she had asked. The question had stopped him in his tracks. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the way she said them. Her voice was steady, but her eyes, those piercing, intelligent eyes, held something else. A vulnerability, a fear, perhaps even a secret. Elias didn't know what to make of it. He had always respected Serafina, admired her intellect and dedication. But now, seeing her like this, he felt a strange sense of unease. "Of course," he had replied, forcing a smile. But Serafina didn't say anything more. She had simply looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "Take care, Captain," she said before walking away. And now, as Elias stood alone on the observation deck, the memory of her words echoed in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He had faced countless battles and faced danger at every turn, but this was different. This wasn't just about a mission. It felt personal. "Captain," a voice broke his thoughts. He turned to see Lieutenant Ava Rhodes, his second-in-command, approaching him. She was a strong, capable officer, one of the few people Elias trusted completely, but even she seemed a little on edge today. "Everything all right, sir?" Ava asked, her eyes scanning his face for any sign of trouble. Elias gave a small nod. "Just thinking," he replied. "About the mission, it's just, I don't know, something feels off." Ava raised an eyebrow. "You're just nervous, Captain. You've led us through worse." "I know," Elias said, but he didn't feel reassured. He turned back to the stars, trying to push his worries aside. "I've led us through plenty of battles, but this is different. It feels like we're walking into something bigger than we can handle." "Maybe," Ava said thoughtfully, "but you've got a reputation for making the impossible happen. If anyone can pull this off, it's you." Elias gave a dry chuckle. "I'm not so sure anymore." There was a brief silence between them as they both stared out into the endless expanse of space. The Vanguard was ready for the journey ahead, but Elias couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for them beyond the stars. Something that neither he nor the fleet was prepared for. Ava eventually broke the silence. "We've got a good crew, Captain. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Elias looked at her, her words offering a small measure of comfort. "Thanks, Ava," he said quietly. He could always count on her, but the unease still lingered in the pit of his stomach. As the time for departure drew closer, Elias made his way to the bridge. The crew was already assembling, and the Vanguard was preparing to depart from the space station. The ship was a sleek, state-of-the-art warship, built to withstand the harshest conditions the galaxy could throw at it. But even its advanced technology couldn't prepare them for what lay ahead. He stepped onto the bridge, where his crew was busy with final preparations. Lieutenant Rhodes was at her station, monitoring the fleet's status, while the rest of the officers worked tirelessly to ensure everything was in order. Elias took his seat in the captain's chair, a position he had held for years. The weight of command was never light, but today it felt heavier than ever. "Captain on the bridge," Ava announced, and the crew all straightened in their seats. "Status report," Elias said, trying to sound calm. All systems are go, Captain, Ava replied. Fleet is ready for departure. All ships are in position. Elias nodded. Very well, let's make this a smooth journey. As the crew worked, Elias found his thoughts drifting back to Serafina. What was it that she had wanted to ask him? Why had she looked at him that way? He couldn't shake the feeling that her question had been important, something he needed to understand. But now, with the mission ahead of him, there was no time to dwell on it. The Vanguard began its journey, leaving the space station behind and venturing into the unknown reaches of the galaxy. Elias couldn't help but feel a sense of finality. This would be his last mission. Once it was over, he would retire and live a quiet life, far away from the dangers of space. Or at least, that's what he had told himself. But as the ship sped through the stars, Elias couldn't help but wonder if there was more to the story. What if the galaxy had more secrets to reveal? What if Serafina's warning was just the beginning? The fleet sailed on, its course set for the outer rim, but Elias couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was about to change, something that would alter the course of humanity's future forever. The Vanguard glided through the vast emptiness of space, its sleek metal surface reflecting the distant light of stars. Elias sat in his captain's chair, eyes fixed on the endless stretch of black, the familiar hum of the ship's engines a constant reminder that they were headed to the outer rim. It was a peaceful moment, but the unease he had felt earlier had not gone away. Instead, it had grown, gnawing at the back of his mind. Serafina's words from earlier echoed in his thoughts. "May I ask you something before you leave?" What had she wanted to ask him? Why had she looked at him that way? There was something more behind her question, something important, but now, with the fleet underway, there was no time to dwell on it. The mission was all that mattered. "Captain," Ava Rhodes' voice cut through his thoughts. He looked up to see her standing near the communications console, her expression serious. "Yes, Lieutenant," Elias replied, trying to sound calm. "There's something you should see," Ava said, her voice laced with concern. She motioned for him to follow, and Elias stood, his boots making soft clanks as he walked over to her. Ava had her eyes fixed on the holographic display in front of her, a map of the surrounding sectors. A series of strange, jagged lines appeared on the map, each one pulsing with an eerie red glow. "What is it?" Elias asked, stepping closer to get a better look. "These readings don't match anything we've encountered before," Ava replied, tapping a few buttons on the console. "I've been monitoring this area for any signs of Zarkan activity, but this is something else." Elias frowned. "What are we looking at?" Ava paused for a moment, then spoke with a hint of uncertainty. "I think it's a distress signal. But it's not coming from a Zarkan ship, and it's not anything we've been briefed on. It's coming from a dead zone, an area where we thought there were no ships." Elias leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. A distress signal? That wasn't good. He had been briefed about the Zarkans, but this was different. A distress signal coming from an empty sector could mean anything, from a stranded ship to something far more dangerous. "Can we triangulate the source?" Elias asked, his voice steady despite the growing tension in his chest. "I've already tried," Ava said, her eyes scanning the data. "But the signal's bouncing off something. It's being hidden, and I don't know why. It's deliberate." Elias felt a cold chill run down his spine. Whoever, or whatever, was sending this signal was not just in need of help. They were hiding something. "Send the coordinates to the fleet," Elias said, his mind racing. "Prepare to change course. We're going to investigate." Ava nodded and quickly sent the orders to the fleet. The Vanguard began to alter its course, veering off its original path toward the unknown sector. Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something bigger than a simple distress call. They were heading straight into a trap. But what kind of trap? As the ship moved further into the dead zone, Elias couldn't help but think about the mission he was supposed to be on. The peace talks with the Zarkans were supposed to be straightforward, an opportunity to end the war that had been dragging on for years. But now, everything felt uncertain. The distress signal was only the beginning. Something was happening, something that had the potential to change everything. The Vanguard's engines hummed louder as they neared the source of the signal. The crew was tense, every officer working with a sense of urgency. The usual chatter on the bridge had quieted, replaced by a heavy silence. Everyone could feel that something was off. Elias stood at the front of the bridge, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared out at the void. The stars looked so peaceful from here, but he knew better than to be fooled by appearances. Space was unforgiving, and the unknown was even more dangerous. "Captain," Ava called out, interrupting his thoughts. She was standing by the navigation console, her brow furrowed as she scanned the readings. "We're getting closer. The signal is coming from a derelict ship. It looks like it's been abandoned for years." Elia's heart skipped a beat. An abandoned ship? That didn't make sense. Why would anyone send out a distress signal from a ship that had been left for so long? It could be a trap, or it could be something far more complicated. "We're within range," Ava said. "I'm getting visual on the ship now." The view screen flickered, and an image of a large, seemingly forgotten vessel appeared. The ship was massive, its hull scarred with years of neglect. The once pristine surface was now covered in patches of rust and damage. It looked like it had been drifting through space for a long time. "Bring us closer," Elias ordered, his voice steady but his mind racing. "Prepare to board." Ava nodded, and the Vanguard slowly maneuvered closer to the derelict ship. The crew worked quickly, preparing the boarding teams and running through the necessary checks. Elias couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As the ship docked with the derelict vessel, Elias grabbed his comm device. "Lieutenant Rhodes, you're with me." "We're going in." Ava nodded, and the two of them, along with a small security team, moved toward the airlock. The rest of the crew remained on standby, ready for whatever might happen next. The airlock doors hissed as they opened, revealing the dark, silent interior of the derelict ship. The moment they stepped inside, Elias felt the weight of the silence pressing down on him. The ship was eerily still, as though time itself had stopped. There was no sign of life, but the distress signal was still active, echoing through the dark corridors. "This place gives me the creeps," Ava muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias didn't respond. He had learned long ago that silence in situations like this was often a sign of danger. The deeper they ventured into the ship, the more they realized something was off. The air was thick with dust, and the halls were lined with broken equipment and abandoned stations. But there was still something in the air, a feeling of being watched as though they were not alone. They finally reached the source of the signal, a small, isolated room deep within the ship. The door was sealed tight, and a blinking red light indicated that the distress signal was coming from inside. Elias motioned for Ava and the security team to stand back. He stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest, and slowly placed his hand on the door control. The door slid open with a low creak, revealing a darkened room. Inside, at the center of the room, was an old communications console. It was surrounded by rusted metal walls, but the signal was still active, blinking steadily. But there was something strange about it. The signal wasn't just a standard distress call. It was a message hidden within the static. Elias activated the console and a garbled voice crackled through the speakers. The words were unintelligible at first, but then they became clear. "Help! Us! The Sovereigns!" "They watching! Escape!" the voice whispered before the signal cut off. The words sent a chill down Elias' spine. The Sovereigns, what did that mean? Were they in danger? Before he could process it, the room suddenly went dark. The console shut off and the red light blinked out. "What the hell just happened?" Ava asked, her voice filled with panic. Elias didn't have an answer. But he knew one thing for sure. The mission had just become a lot more complicated. Elias' heart raced as the console flickered back to life, the dim red glow casting eerie shadows across the room. The words from the distress signal still echoed in his mind. The Sovereigns. "Watching, escape." He turned sharply toward the crew members behind him. "Check the ship's systems," he ordered, his voice tight. "Something's not right here." Ava stepped forward. "Captain, what was that?" she asked, her voice still shaken from the sudden silence. The security team stood in place, guns raised, scanning the dark corners of the room. They were all tense, ready for anything. Elias didn't answer immediately. His thoughts were a whirlwind, trying to make sense of the message. The Sovereigns were an ancient alien race, something out of humanity's worst nightmares, powerful, calculating, and older than most of the known civilizations in the galaxy. Their very name sent a chill down the spine of anyone who knew the history of galactic warfare. Why would their name come up in a distress call from a ship that had been abandoned for years? Ava was already working on the console, her fingers flying over the keys, trying to get it back online. "I can't get a fix on anything, Captain," she said after a few moments. "The ship's systems are mostly offline, but I can access the logs. I'm pulling up what I can." Elias stood silently, watching her work. The dark room seemed to grow colder with each passing second, as if the ship itself was alive and aware of their presence. The message had triggered something deep in his gut, a sense of dread he couldn't shake. "There," Ava said, breaking the silence. "I've got some data, it's partial, but it's better than nothing." The screen flickered to life, displaying scrambled data. The image on the screen was a series of log entries from the derelict ship. There were records of normal operations up until a certain point, then everything went silent. The last log entry stood out. "Alert! Sovereign fleet detected. Prepare for immediate evacuation." "All personnel." The rest of the log was corrupted, but the words were clear enough to send a shockwave through Elia's mind. The Sovereigns had been here. That wasn't just some coincidence. The crew had known about them, and they had been running, trying to escape. "What does it mean?" Ava asked, her voice trembling. "Why are they here, and why did they leave the distress signal?" Elias looked up from the screen, his mind racing. He knew there was no time to waste. They couldn't just stand around and wonder about the Sovereigns. They needed answers, and they needed them now. "Get to the bridge," he said. "We're going to finish what we started. I'm not leaving here without finding out what happened to this crew." The airlock doors slid open with a hiss as Elias and Ava stepped back onto the Vanguard. The crew was already alert, sensing the shift in mood. Whatever had been hidden on that derelict ship was far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Back on the bridge, Elias took a seat in his command chair, his mind still racing through the possibilities. "Lieutenant Rhodes," he said, "I want you to scan the area, full range. I want to know if there are any sovereign ships nearby or anything that could pose a threat to us." "Aye, Captain," Ava replied, her fingers already working the console. The crew worked in silence, the tension thick in the air. Elias watched the stars on the view screen, his thoughts distant. The message from the abandoned ship kept playing over and over in his head. The Sovereigns were coming, but why now? Why had they waited all this time? And what did they want from humanity? "I've got something," Ava's voice broke through his thoughts. "There's a large energy signature approaching from the edge of the system. It's not exactly a ship, but it's definitely powered up." Elia's heart skipped a beat. "Can we track it?" "We're trying, but the signature is moving fast and it's not consistent with anything we've seen before. It's as if it's shifting in and out of normal space." Elias stood, a surge of adrenaline pumping through his veins. This was no ordinary threat. The Sovereigns had advanced technology far beyond anything humanity had developed. They had weapons capable of annihilating entire fleets in seconds. The thought of one of their ships, or worse, one of their weapons, approaching filled Elias with a sense of urgency he had never known before. "We need to be ready for anything," he said, his voice firm. "All crew, prepare for evasive maneuvers. If that thing is what I think it is, we're going to need every advantage we can get." Ava worked quickly, issuing orders to the crew. The Vanguard hummed as its systems powered up, and Elias could feel the shift in the air. The ship was ready for whatever was coming. But just as Elias thought they might have a chance to prepare, the view screen flashed with an explosion of light. A massive distortion in space appeared before them, a rip in the fabric of reality itself. It was like watching the stars bend and warp, space itself stretching and twisting. "Brace for impact," Elias shouted, gripping the arms of his chair as the ship lurched violently. The crew scrambled to hold on as the ship rocked, the whole station seeming to shake under the strain. The distortion grew larger, and the energy signature became clearer. A massive form emerged from the rift, a ship, but not like any ship Elias had ever seen. It was enormous, its dark hull glinting with energy as it moved with unnatural speed. "It's them," Ava whispered, her voice filled with awe and fear. Elias' mind raced as he processed the situation. The Sovereigns were here, and they had come in full force. "Bring us around," Elias commanded, trying to keep his voice steady. "Get us out of here." But the ship wasn't responding as it should. The systems were malfunctioning, the controls slipping out of his grasp. "Captain, they're locking onto us," Ava called out. "We're caught in some kind of tractor beam?" Elia's heart pounded in his chest as he glanced at the view screen. The Sovereign ship's massive hull loomed larger, the energy signatures intensifying. This wasn't just an invasion, it was an overwhelming show of power. The Sovereigns weren't just here to destroy them, they were here to make a statement. And that statement was clear: humanity was out of its depth. "Activate shields," Elias ordered, gripping the armrests of his chair. "Get us free," but it was too late. The Sovereign ship's beam grew stronger, and the vanguard was pulled closer and closer toward the rift. The crew was doing everything they could to fight back, but Elias knew they were losing the battle. No matter what they tried, they were helpless against the sheer power of the Sovereigns. "We can't fight this," Elias muttered, his voice grim. "We need to think of something else, now." The thought of being captured, of being dragged into the Sovereign ship's maw, made Elias' stomach churn. He had led many missions in his life, but this one felt different. This wasn't just about survival, it was about humanity's future. But there was still a chance. He wasn't ready to give up yet. "Everyone to escape pods," Elias ordered, his mind made up. "Prepare for evacuation. We can't let them take us alive." The vanguard shook again, and Elias felt his heart race as the Sovereign ship's tractor beam intensified. The viewscreen displayed the massive alien vessel now towering before them, its sleek, dark hull gleaming with an unnatural energy. Elias' thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and fear. They were being pulled in helpless, unable to escape the overwhelming force of the Sovereign's technology. "Prepare for evacuation," Elias shouted again, his voice barely audible over the ship's shaking. "All crew to the escape pods, now!" The crew rushed into action. Panic was setting in, but the officers knew what to do. They had trained for situations like this, though nothing could have prepared them for a Sovereign fleet descending upon them. Elias remained in his chair, his hands clenched into fists. He wasn't going to leave the ship without a fight. The Vanguard was humanity's pride, their most advanced warship, and he refused to let it fall without giving everything he had. "Captain, we've lost control," Ava's voice crackled over the comms. "The ship's systems are completely down. We can't power anything up. We're at their mercy." Elias stood up, ignoring the gravity of the situation. "We won't give up," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Prepare the secondary systems. Anything we can use to fight back." But Ava's voice interrupted him again, this time with more urgency. "There's no time, Captain. The Sovereign ship is getting closer. They're locking onto our core." Elias' stomach dropped. The core. If the Sovereigns took that, it would be over. The Vanguard's core was what powered the ship's systems. If they took control of it, humanity's most advanced ship would be theirs. He had no choice but to act quickly. "Is there any chance we can disable the core remotely?" Elias asked, turning to Ava, who was still working feverishly at her console. "I'm trying, but the systems are too scrambled," Ava said, her voice tinged with frustration. "There's too much interference. The tractor beam is affecting our power grid. We can't reach the core's security systems." Elias cursed under his breath. There had to be a way. He couldn't let them have the core. His thoughts raced, his mind desperately trying to come up with a plan. Then he remembered. The last thing Serafina had said to him, the way she had looked at him, the vulnerability in her eyes. Had she known something? Was there a way out of this? What was she trying to warn him about? Had she known that they were coming? "Lieutenant Rhodes," Elias said, his voice calm now. He took a deep breath, trying to focus. "I need you to do something. You have to get to the engineering deck and initiate a manual lockdown on the core. Can you do that?" Ava hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, Captain." "I'll do it." Elias watched as she sprinted toward the exit. She didn't look back. He hoped she would make it in time. He had to believe she could. The Sovereign ship was almost upon them now, its massive form filling the viewscreen. The Vanguard was still being pulled toward it, unable to resist. Elias could feel the strain on the ship as the tractor beam tightened its grip. If they didn't do something soon, they would be boarded. He wasn't about to let that happen. He turned toward the communications console. "Get me a channel to the Sovereign ship," he said. His voice was steady, though inside he was tense. "I want to speak to whoever is in charge." The comms officer, who had been working tirelessly, nodded. "Channel open, Captain." Elias took a deep breath, then spoke into the mic. "This is Captain Elias Drake of the Vanguard. We are not your prisoners. You may have us trapped, but we will fight to the end. We will not surrender." There was a long pause, and then a voice crackled through the comms. It was cold, calm, and alien. "We do not seek your surrender, Captain Drake," the voice said, its tone laced with an unsettling calm. "We have been watching your species for some time. You are intriguing, but your time has come." Elias clenched his jaw. "What do you want from us?" "We seek nothing from you," the voice replied. "But you are a threat to the balance we have maintained for eons. You will either submit to our will or you will be extinguished." Elias felt a surge of anger. "You don't know humanity," he growled. "We will never submit. You'll have to destroy us first." The voice on the comms remained indifferent. Your pride is commendable, but futile. Your species is not ready for the galaxy's true order. We are the sovereigns. We do not negotiate. Before Elias could respond, the sovereign ship released a sudden pulse of energy. The Vanguard systems flickered, and Elias felt the ship lurch forward as if an invisible hand had gripped it tighter. He was running out of time. Ava was still on her way to the engineering deck. He just had to hold on long enough. Suddenly, an explosion shook the ship. The deck beneath Elias' feet groaned, and sparks flew from nearby consoles. The Vanguard had taken a direct hit from the sovereign vessel's weapons. "Damage report," Elias barked, gripping the arms of his chair. "We've taken heavy damage to the port side," the damage control officer reported. "Hull integrity is failing in several sections. The engines are still operational, but we're losing power quickly." Elias' heart pounded in his chest. This was bad, very bad. They couldn't afford to lose the engines. If they did, they'd be at the mercy of the sovereign ship. There had to be something he could do. "Captain, I've initiated the core lockdown," Ava's voice came through the comms. "But I've lost contact with the systems. I'm going to try to override the shutdown. Hold on, Captain, I'm almost there." Elias squeezed his eyes shut. He trusted Ava. If anyone could pull it off, it was her. But time was running out. He couldn't just sit here and wait. He had to do something. "Set a course for the sovereign ship," Elias said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "All ahead full." The helmsman looked at him in shock. "Captain, are you sure we can't fight them head-on?" "I don't care," Elias snapped. "We're going in. We've got one chance to make a stand." The crew worked quickly, shifting the course of the Vanguard as best as they could under the pressure. The ship groaned again, but the engines responded, and they surged forward, heading directly for the sovereign ship. It was a desperate move, one that might not work, but it was the only move they had left. The sovereign ship loomed closer, its dark form filled the view screen. Elias held his breath, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. They were nearly there. "Captain," Ava's voice came through again, her voice strained. "I've overridden the shutdown. The core's secured, but we've got a bigger problem. They've started to deploy smaller ships from their vessel. They're preparing to board us." Elias' mind raced. They had no choice now. "Prepare to repel boarders," he shouted to his crew. "This is it." All hands were fighting until the end. The sovereign ships were approaching fast. The Vanguard's crew readied themselves for the worst. Elias knew this battle was far from over. But he also knew one thing for sure. Humanity was not going to go down without a fight. Elias gripped the armrests of his command chair as the Vanguard shook under the barrage of energy blasts from the sovereign ship. The view outside the bridge was a dizzying display of flashing lights and dark shapes. Small sovereign ships had been deployed, swarming around the Vanguard like predatory insects. The Vanguard, despite its advanced design, was no match for the overwhelming firepower of the sovereigns. But Elias had no intention of surrendering. Not now, not ever. "Captain, they've launched boarding pods." Ava's voice came through the comms, calm but laced with tension. "They'll hit the port side in 30 seconds. We need to defend that area." Elias didn't hesitate. "Prepare defensive teams, all crew to their stations. We won't let them take this ship." As the comms officer began issuing orders to the crew, Elias stood, his mind racing. The Sovereign's boarding pods would breach the Vanguard within moments, and they had no way of knowing what kind of force the Sovereigns would send. But one thing was certain, they wouldn't go down without a fight. "Lieutenant Rhodes, what's our status on the core?" Elias asked, his voice steady, though the situation was dire. "I've got control over it again, Captain," Ava replied. "But the sovereign ships are trying to override our systems. We need to protect the core at all costs. If they get their hands on it—" "I know," Elias cut in. "We're not letting that happen. Keep it secure. I'll handle the rest." Ava's voice came through again, this time filled with urgency. "Captain, I'm tracking a massive energy signature coming from the sovereign ship." "They're charging a weapon." Elias' eyes narrowed. "How long until it fires?" "Less than 2 minutes." That was all they had. The Vanguard's shields were holding for now, but with the sovereign weapon charging, it was only a matter of time before they breached the ship. Elias' heart pounded in his chest as he turned toward his crew. "We need to get to the lower decks," Elias said, his voice firm. "Get to the defensive positions. We can't let them breach the hull." The crew sprang into action. The sounds of boots running, weapons being readied, and the hum of emergency lights filled the air. Elias felt a familiar rush of adrenaline as he and his team made their way to the lower decks. The Sovereigns were relentless, and they would stop at nothing to take the Vanguard. But Ilias had one advantage they didn't: humanity's unyielding spirit. As they reached the lower decks, Ilias could hear the explosions in the distance, echoing through the ship's halls. The sovereign boarding pods had already landed, and the enemy was making their way through the corridors. Ilias' team prepared for battle, taking their positions behind cover. They didn't know how many sovereigns they would face, but they were ready. Minutes passed like hours. The sounds of heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway, growing louder with each passing second. Ilias tightened his grip on his weapon. He could feel the tension in the air, the waiting, the anticipation. The sovereigns were coming, and then they were there. The first wave of sovereigns appeared in the hallway, tall, imposing figures clad in black armor, their weapons glowing with a deadly energy. Ilia's heart raced as the sovereigns advanced, their eyes glowing with an eerie light. They moved with precision, their every step calculated, their every movement a threat. "Hold your fire," Ilias ordered in a low voice. His team had trained for this moment, and they knew the plan. They had to wait until the sovereigns were in range. The seconds stretched on, and then with a sharp signal, Ilias gave the order. "Fire!" The hallway erupted into chaos. The crack of weapons firing, the hiss of energy blasts filling the air. Ilias and his team opened fire, hitting the sovereigns with precise shots. But the sovereigns didn't hesitate. They returned fire, their weapons firing in rapid succession. Ilias ducked behind cover as the energy blasts whizzed by, narrowly missing him. He could hear the sound of his team's weapons as they continued to fire at the sovereigns, trying to hold them off. But the sovereigns were relentless, their armor impervious to most of the vanguard's weapons. Ilias knew they needed to act fast. "Focus on their weapons," Ilias shouted. "We need to take them down before they reach the core." The battle intensified, the sound of weapons firing echoing through the halls. Ilias' mind raced as he looked for a way to turn the tide. The sovereigns were powerful, but humanity had something they didn't: determination. As he peeked out from behind cover, Ilias saw a group of sovereigns moving toward the core. They were heading straight for the heart of the vanguard. "No," Ilias shouted, panic rising in his chest. If they reached the core, it was over. Everything they had fought for, everything they had worked toward, would be destroyed. He turned to his team. "We need to stop them now." Ilias and his team sprinted toward the core, firing at the sovereigns as they moved. The sovereigns were relentless, but Ilias could feel the weight of the moment. They couldn't let the vanguard fall. As they reached the core's security room, Ilias saw the sovereigns planting explosives on the walls. They were trying to breach the core's defenses. "No!" Ilias shouted again, rushing forward. He fired at the sovereigns, taking them down one by one. But the sovereigns were too many. The room was swarming with them, and the explosives were already set. Ilias' mind raced. There had to be another way. "Get to the console," Ilias shouted. "Override the detonation sequence," Ava's voice crackled through the comms. "Captain, the weapon is almost ready to fire. You need to disable their power core now." Ilias gritted his teeth. He had no choice. He had to stop the sovereigns at any cost. He rushed toward the console, his heart pounding in his chest. The sovereigns were closing in, but he couldn't let them win. Not now. Not after everything humanity had fought for. With shaking hands, Ilias typed in the override codes, his fingers flying across the keys. The seconds felt like hours as the countdown on the screen ticked down. The sovereigns were closing in on him, but he didn't care. This was his last stand, and he was going to give everything he had. "Come on," Ilias muttered to himself, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please, please." Finally, with a final press of a button, the console flashed green. The detonation sequence was disabled. Ilias let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The core was safe, for now, but the battle wasn't over. The sovereigns were still fighting, and they were still trying to break through the vanguard's defenses. Ilias looked up, his eyes meeting those of his crew. They had done it. They had held the line. For a moment, everything was still. The ship's systems were failing, the crew was battered, and the sovereigns had taken heavy losses. But they hadn't won yet. Humanity wasn't done. Ilias turned toward his crew, determination in his eyes. "We're not finished," he said, his voice strong. "We've still got a fight ahead of us, and we're going to win."